A billionaire tried to ruin a woman's life, but her love made him regret everything. The towering glass windows of Blackwood Enterprises reflected the evening skyline, a breathtaking contrast to the darkness inside Adrian Blackwood's office. He stood near his desk, one hand gripping the edge, his sharp eyes scanning the city below. To the world, he was a billionaire, a man who commanded power with ruthless precision. But beneath the tailored suits and cold expressions, Adrian was a man who had learned the harshest lesson of all. Love was nothing more than a weakness, a liability that could be exploited. The scars of betrayal ran deep, buried beneath years of calculated ambition. His brother, Ethan, had once been the heart of their family, the dreamer, the optimist. He had believed in love, in promises, in the idea that sincerity could overcome anything. But that belief had been his downfall. One woman had changed everything, stripping Ethan of his dignity, his fortune, and ultimately his life. Adrian had watched helplessly as his brother crumbled under the weight of heartbreak and scandal. That was the day Adrian had sworn never to make the same mistake. He had hardened his heart, choosing power over emotions, control over vulnerability. And now, after all these years, fate had delivered an opportunity he never expected: Elena Hayes. Her name alone reignited the fire of long-buried resentment. She was the daughter of the woman who had ruined Ethan, a reminder of the past Adrian had never forgiven. At first, he had dismissed her as insignificant, just another struggling business owner in a world that showed no mercy. But when he learned that her cafe, her so-called home, was on the verge of collapse, something inside him stirred. A perfect plan took shape in his mind, one that would serve justice in the way he saw fit. He would take everything from her, piece by piece, just as her mother had done to Ethan. Elena, unaware of the storm brewing against her, stood behind the counter of her cafe, her fingers wrapped tightly around a steaming mug of coffee. The scent of freshly brewed espresso filled the air, mingling with the comforting aroma of vanilla and cinnamon. It was late, and the shop was empty, save for a few lingering customers. She should have gone home hours ago, but exhaustion had become her constant companion. The bills were piling up. The suppliers had started backing out one by one. The once busy cafe, her father's legacy, was slipping through her fingers. She sighed, pushing back a loose strand of hair as she wiped down the counter. She had spent years building this place, pouring her heart into every detail. It was more than just a business. It was the only piece of stability she had left. Her mother, once a vibrant and independent woman, had grown weaker with each passing day. The medical bills alone were enough to drown them, but Elena refused to give up. She had always believed that hard work and perseverance would get her through anything. But lately, it felt as though the world was closing in on her. She glanced at the unopened letters stacked beside the register, each one carrying news she wasn't ready to face. Her rent had increased without warning, suppliers had suddenly cut ties, and even her landlord had hinted that new buyers were interested in the surrounding properties. It was as if someone was deliberately trying to choke her out of business. But why? A deep sense of unease settled in her chest, but she pushed it aside. There was no time for fear. She had to fight. Adrian watched from afar as his plan unfolded with precision. His acquisitions team had already secured the surrounding properties. He had tightened the supply chain, ensuring that Elena would be backed into a corner with nowhere to turn. He had expected resistance, of course, but he knew how these things played out. Sooner or later, she would have no choice but to surrender. What he hadn't expected was her resilience. Every time he thought she would break, she found a way to push forward. He had seen the desperation in her eyes when her suppliers pulled out, yet she still greeted her customers with a warm smile. He had anticipated her frustration when the rent doubled overnight, yet she stayed up late, working twice as hard to keep the cafe running. And through it all, she never stopped caring. Adrian watched, unnoticed, the night she closed the cafe early to help an elderly woman carry her groceries home. He saw how she stayed up long after closing, ensuring that her employees were paid before she even considered her own needs. She didn't just run a business, she had built a community. It made no sense to him. Kindness, in his world, was a liability, a weakness that left people open to exploitation. And yet, she moved through life as if kindness was the only thing that truly mattered. It was infuriating. It was also the first thing that made his resolve falter. Elena stood outside her cafe, locking the doors for the night, when a sleek black car pulled up along the curb. The tinted window rolled down slowly, and a man stepped out, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit. She had seen him before, Adrian Blackwood. He didn't belong here, not in this neighborhood, not in her world. Her pulse quickened, but she refused to look away as he approached. "Elena Hayes," he said, his voice smooth and controlled. "We need to talk." She crossed her arms, meeting his gaze without flinching. "If you're here to offer to buy me out, save your breath. My cafe is not for sale." Adrian smirked, a slow, calculating expression that made her stomach tighten. "That's unfortunate, because whether you like it or not, your time here is running out." Her hands clenched at her sides. "Why are you doing this?" His expression remained unreadable. "Because I can." Fury burned in her chest. "So that's it? You destroy people's lives just because you feel like it?" He tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words. "Not just anyone, only those who deserve it." She took a step closer, anger flashing in her eyes. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I won't let you win. I fought too hard to let someone like you take everything from me." Adrian had expected her defiance. He had prepared for it. But what he hadn't anticipated was the intensity in her gaze, the fire that refused to be extinguished. For the first time, he questioned whether he had truly thought this through. Because Elena Hayes wasn't just some pawn in his game. And for the first time in years, Adrian Blackwood wasn't sure if he was in control at all. Elena's hands trembled at her sides, but she refused to let him see. She wasn't afraid of Adrian Blackwood. At least, that was what she told herself. But there was something in his gaze, something cold and calculating, that sent a shiver down her spine. He was a man who was used to winning, to bending the world to his will. And yet, she wouldn't let him win. Adrian watched her closely, his sharp eyes noting every flicker of emotion that crossed her face. He had seen countless people crumble under pressure, their will bending like weak glass under his control. But Elena wasn't like them. She was fire wrapped in soft edges, stubbornness cloaked in quiet resilience. Even now, when she had every reason to break, she stood firm. It should have been satisfying to see her like this, trapped, desperate, helpless. But something unexpected stirred inside him. It wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't victory. It was doubt. He pushed the thought aside. Doubt had no place in his world. "You should reconsider my offer," Adrian said smoothly, his voice void of emotion. "There's no shame in knowing when to walk away." Elena's jaw tightened. "You think I'm going to just hand over my life's work to you? You don't know me at all." Adrian smirked. "I know you better than you think." Her eyes narrowed. "You don't know anything about me." "Don't I?" He took a slow step closer. "You wake up before dawn, struggling to keep this cafe afloat while the world around you closes in. Your mother is sick, the bills are piling up, and you tell yourself that if you just work a little harder, everything will be okay. But deep down, you're running out of options, aren't you?" Elena's breath caught in her throat. She hated that he was right. She hated that he knew. She lifted her chin, refusing to let him see how much his words had shaken her. "I'll find a way." His smirk didn't waver. "You're running out of time." She glared at him, her fingers curling into fists. "Why are you doing this?" Adrian hesitated for a fraction of a second, so brief that she almost missed it. Then, his expression hardened again. "Because people like you don't get to win." Her heart pounded in her chest. "People like me? The ones who pretend kindness is enough. Who think the world plays fair if you just work hard enough." His voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it. Something raw, something personal. "It doesn't. The world belongs to those who take what they want." Elena stared at him, her breath shallow. There was something in his tone that made her wonder, was this really about her? Or was she just a target for something much bigger, something he wasn't saying? She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay calm. "You're wrong." Adrian raised an eyebrow. Am I? Yes. She took a step closer, her voice steady. You think power is all that matters. That taking from others makes you stronger. But real strength? Real power? It's standing up for what you believe in, even when the odds are against you. His smirk faltered. For the first time since their conversation began, he didn't have an immediate response. Elena took that as a small victory. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Adrian standing alone in the dim light of the street. He should have felt triumphant. She was struggling. She was exactly where he wanted her, on the verge of breaking. But as he watched her disappear into the night, Adrian felt something he hadn't in years. Regret. And he hated it. The next few days passed in a blur. Elena barely had time to breathe as she fought to keep the cafe alive. She reached out to every contact she had, searching for new suppliers, new investors, anything that could keep her afloat. But doors kept slamming in her face. It was as if someone had poisoned the very ground she walked on. She wasn't naive. She knew exactly who was behind it. Adrian Blackwood, the man who had everything and still wanted more. The thought of him made her blood boil. She refused to let him win. But with every passing day, her options dwindled. And then, the final blow came. She arrived at the cafe one morning to find an eviction notice nailed to her door. Her heart stopped. She ripped the paper from the frame, her hands shaking as she read the words over and over, hoping she had misread them. But the reality was clear. She had 30 days. 30 days before everything she had worked for was gone. She stumbled back, her legs weak beneath her. This couldn't be happening. Panic clawed at her chest, but she forced herself to breathe. She had to fight. She had to do something. She clenched the notice in her fist. There was only one person who could answer for this. Adrian. The air inside Blackwood Enterprises was cold, sterile, devoid of warmth. Elena stormed through the grand entrance, ignoring the confused receptionist's protests as she made her way to the elevators. Adrenaline coursed through her veins. She had nothing left to lose. The elevator doors opened to the top floor, revealing a sleek, modern office with floor-to-ceiling windows. And there, standing behind a massive desk, was the man who had single-handedly torn her life apart. Adrian looked up as she approached. He had been expecting her. "Elena," he said calmly, as if they were old friends. She slammed the eviction notice onto his desk. "You did this." He glanced at the paper, then met her gaze without a hint of remorse. "Yes." Rage burned through her. "Why?" He leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I told you. This is how the world works." Her hands trembled. "You think destroying me will make you stronger?" A muscle in his jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Elena stepped closer, her voice shaking with emotion. "What happened to you? What made you like this?" Adrian stiffened. For the first time, something flickered in his eyes, something she couldn't quite define. Silence stretched between them. Then he exhaled, slow and measured. "You wouldn't understand." "Try me," she challenged. For a moment, he almost looked like he would. Almost. But then, his expression hardened once more. "You're wasting your time." His voice was cold again, distant. "This conversation changes nothing." Elena swallowed back the lump in her throat. She had come here expecting a fight. She had expected him to gloat, to revel in his victory. But instead, all she saw was a man who looked tired, broken. It didn't make his actions forgivable. But for the first time, she realized Adrian Blackwood wasn't as invincible as he seemed. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't beyond saving. Elena had thought she had faced the worst of Adrian Blackwood's wrath, but she had been wrong. The eviction notice had only been the beginning. In the days that followed, his grip tightened around her world like a vice, squeezing the life out of everything she had built. Her suppliers cut ties, claiming they could no longer afford the risk of doing business with her. The bank denied her loan application, despite her spotless record. Even the cafe's most loyal customers started to dwindle, as if an unseen force had whispered in their ears, warning them away. She knew who was behind it. Adrian wasn't just trying to destroy her business. He wanted to break her completely. But he had underestimated her. Every new setback only fueled her determination. Every door that slammed in her face made her more resolved to push forward. She woke up earlier, worked later, fought harder. If Adrian thought she would crumble under his pressure, he would be sorely disappointed. And yet, as the days passed, exhaustion weighed down on her like an iron chain. She wasn't just fighting a battle for her cafe. She was taking care of her mother, whose condition was worsening by the day. The stress of it all made her bones ache, but she had no choice. She couldn't afford to slow down. So when Adrian called her, requesting, no, demanding a meeting, she almost didn't go. But deep down, she knew she had to face him eventually. She had to know what game he was playing. When she arrived at his office, he was waiting for her, leaning against his desk with the same cold smirk that made her blood boil. He looked completely at ease, as if he hadn't spent the past few weeks systematically ruining her life. "You're late," he said. Elena folded her arms. "I wasn't planning to come at all. And yet, here you are." He gestured for her to sit, but she didn't move. She wasn't going to play by his rules. "No," she said, voice shaking with fury. "You're a coward. A man so consumed by revenge that you're willing to destroy someone who had nothing to do with your past." For a brief moment, something flickered in his eyes, something dark and unreadable. But then it was gone, replaced by the same icy indifference. "You have until the end of the week," he said simply. "Make your choice wisely." Elena wanted to scream, to throw something, to wipe that smug expression off his face. But instead, she turned on her heel and walked away, her heart pounding with rage. But as soon as she stepped out of his office, her phone rang. Her heart stopped when she saw the hospital's name on the screen. Her mother. She ran. The moment she arrived at the hospital, she knew it was bad. The doctors' faces were grave, their words filled with medical jargon that blurred in her mind. All she could focus on was her mother, lying in that hospital bed, looking weaker than ever. "She needs treatment," the doctor said gently. "Without it, she won't make it." Elena's breath hitched. "How much?" The doctor hesitated before naming the price. It was more than she had, more than she could ever hope to make. She felt her world tilt, the weight of reality crashing down on her shoulders. How was she supposed to choose? Her mother's life or her own freedom? She already knew the answer. Elena barely remembered driving to Blackwood Enterprises, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The moment she stepped into Adrian's office, she felt like she was stepping into a trap, but she had no choice. He looked up from his desk, unsurprised to see her. "I assume you've come to accept my offer." Elena swallowed hard. "I'll do it." Adrian leaned back, his eyes gleaming with something unreadable. "Good choice, but not for the cafe." Her voice wavered, but she forced herself to stand tall. "You're going to pay for my mother's treatment." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Fine." Her stomach twisted. "What's the catch?" He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You work for me. 6 months. No complaints, no resistance. You do as I say, when I say." Elena's heart pounded. She knew this was more than just a job offer. This was control. This was a way to remind her that no matter how strong she thought she was, he still held all the power. But she didn't have a choice. With a deep breath, she held out her hand. "Deal." His fingers closed over hers, firm and unyielding. And just like that, she belonged to Adrian Blackwood. Elena had thought working for Adrian would be unbearable, but she hadn't realized just how much he intended to make her life miserable. From the moment she stepped into his world, he ensured she knew who was in control. Every task was impossible, every demand unreasonable. He called her at all hours, giving her work that had nothing to do with her actual job. She was more of an errand girl than an assistant, running around completing ridiculous tasks that served no purpose other than to remind her of her place. He was testing her, pushing her, and she refused to break. No matter how cruel he was, no matter how much he tried to make her suffer, she stood her ground. But what surprised her most wasn't Adrian's cruelty. It was the moments in between, the moments when she caught glimpses of something else. The late nights when he thought she wasn't looking, staring out the window with a haunted expression. The way his hands tightened into fists when he heard certain names. The exhaustion hidden beneath his cold mask. He was a man at war with himself. And as much as she wanted to hate him, She couldn't help but wonder what had made him this way. Then, one evening, she found something that changed everything. She had been organizing files in his office, trying to distract herself from the weight of her own problems, when she noticed a drawer slightly ajar. She hesitated, then pulled it open. Inside was a single photograph, worn and faded with time. She picked it up, her heart pounding. It was a picture of two boys, laughing in the sun. One of them was unmistakably Adrian. The other, Elena, froze. She knew that face. Her stomach twisted as realization dawned. This wasn't just about her cafe. It wasn't just about revenge. Their families were connected in a way she had never imagined. And if Adrian ever found out the truth, it could destroy them both. Elena's fingers trembled as she held the photograph, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The more she stared at the faded image, the more the pieces of a long-forgotten puzzle seemed to snap into place. The boy standing next to Adrian looked painfully familiar. His dark curls, the mischievous glint in his eyes, the dimple that appeared in his left cheek when he smiled. It all sent a wave of recognition crashing over her. Memories she had buried long ago came rushing back. A boy who used to play in the fields near her childhood home. A boy who had once been her mother's friend's son. The boy who had disappeared without a trace, his family vanishing from their lives as if they had never existed. She sucked in a shaky breath, her mind racing. Could it be? No, it wasn't possible. Was Adrian Blackwood connected to her past in ways she had never realized? And if so, why had she never known? A sudden voice shattered the silence. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Elena jerked, nearly dropping the photograph as Adrian's sharp, commanding voice filled the room. Her stomach clenched as she slowly turned to find him standing in the doorway, his expression cold and unreadable. Her fingers tightened around the photo before she quickly slipped it back into the drawer. I was just organizing the files like you asked," she stammered, forcing her voice to stay steady. Adrian's gaze flickered to the open drawer, his eyes narrowing dangerously. "I don't remember asking you to snoop through my personal belongings," he said, his voice eerily calm. Elena's pulse raced. She had seen too much. She knew it. "I wasn't snooping," she said quickly, willing her voice not to betray her panic. "The drawer was open. I was just putting things in order." Adrian stepped closer, his towering presence making the air feel suffocating. His eyes, so piercing and dark, locked onto hers, searching, assessing. For a moment, she thought he would call her out on her lie, demand to know what she had seen. But instead, he reached past her, yanked the drawer shut with a sharp snap, and said, "Stay out of things that don't concern you." Elena swallowed, nodding stiffly. Understood. He didn't move, his gaze lingering on her for a moment too long. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing there with her heart still hammering against her ribs. As soon as he was gone, Elena exhaled shakily, gripping the edge of the desk to steady herself. She had come here expecting to work under a ruthless man who wanted to make her life miserable. But now there was something deeper at play, and if she wasn't careful, she would find herself tangled in a past that could destroy them both. The next few days were suffocating. Adrian was more demanding than ever, throwing impossible tasks her way, his cold demeanor even icier than before. It was as if he sensed she had seen something she shouldn't have, and this was his way of punishing her for it. She barely had time to breathe, let alone think about what she had discovered. Every moment of her day was consumed by his orders, his presence looming over her like a dark shadow. But even as he pushed her to the breaking point, she couldn't stop seeing glimpses of the man beneath the ruthless billionaire. The one who stayed in his office long after everyone had left, staring at nothing with an expression that almost seemed lost. The one whose jaw tightened at the mention of family, his fingers curling into fists as if holding on to ghosts only he could see. Despite everything, she couldn't shake the feeling that Adrian wasn't just cruel for the sake of it. He was running from something, hiding something, and against her better judgment, she wanted to know what. One evening, long after the office had emptied, Elena found herself alone in the hallway outside Adrian's office. She was supposed to drop off some documents, But as she reached for the doorknob, she hesitated. Through the slight gap in the door, she could see him sitting at his desk, his head in his hands, his usual cold mask slipping away. It was the first time she had seen him like this. Vulnerable. Human. A lump formed in her throat as she watched him, her heart clenching at the sight. This wasn't the Adrian Blackwood who threatened her, who wielded power like a weapon. This was a man weighed down by something unseen, something that went far beyond his vendetta against her. Before she could second-guess herself, she knocked lightly. Adrian's head snapped up, his expression instantly hardening. "What?" Elena hesitated before stepping inside, placing the documents on his desk. "I finished the reports you asked for," she said, trying to keep her voice neutral. He barely glanced at them. "Leave them and go." She should have. She should have walked away like she always did. But something about the way he looked, the exhaustion in his eyes, the tension in his shoulders, made her pause. "Are you okay?" The words left her mouth before she could stop them. Adrian stiffened, his eyes flashing with something unreadable. "I don't remember asking for your concern." Elena bit her lip. You look tired." He let out a humorless chuckle. "I'm always tired." The admission caught her off guard. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them. Then, just as quickly as the moment had come, Adrian's walls slammed back into place. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze turning cold once more. "If you have time to worry about me, then I'm clearly not giving you enough work." Elena sighed, shaking her head. "You really don't let anyone in, do you?" His jaw clenched. "No, and I never will." Something in his tone sent a shiver down her spine. A warning, a promise. But for the first time since meeting him, she wasn't sure if it was meant for her or for himself. Days passed, and though nothing was said about the photograph, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing at the edge of something dangerous. Her mother's health had stabilized thanks to the treatment Adrian had funded, but the weight of their arrangement pressed down on her every day. And then, one evening, everything changed. She was working late again, sifting through old files in Adrian's office, when she found another photograph, this one buried beneath a stack of papers. Her blood ran cold. It was the same boy from before, the one standing next to Adrian. But this time, there was someone else in the picture. Her mother. Elena's breath caught as she stared at the image, her mind racing with questions. Why was her mother in a photo with Adrian's family? What was the connection between them? She needed answers, but something told her that once she found them, there would be no turning back. Because the more she uncovered, the more she realized this wasn't just about business. This was about family, and some secrets were never meant to be unearthed. Elena sat stiffly in the grand study, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The dim glow of the chandelier above did little to ease the unease curling in her stomach. Across from her, Nicholas Grayson, Adrian's most trusted confidant, poured himself a glass of whiskey. He was an older man, one who had been by Adrian's side for years, loyal and unwavering. Tonight, however, his usual sharp demeanor was dulled, his movements slower, more thoughtful. The tension in the air was thick, pressing against Elena like an invisible force. She had never spoken much to Nicholas, only exchanging brief words when necessary. But tonight felt different. Tonight, she had questions she wasn't sure she was ready to hear the answers to. Nicholas took a slow sip of his drink before finally breaking the silence. "You shouldn't be here so late," he said, his voice carrying a quiet edge. Elena met his gaze. "I had work to finish," she said, though they both knew that wasn't the whole truth. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You're looking for something, aren't you?" She hesitated, her pulse quickening. I need to understand." A tired sigh escaped him. He set his glass down on the desk, rubbing his temples as if burdened by a weight too heavy to carry. "There are things you don't want to understand, Miss Carter." She straightened, refusing to back down. "Does this have something to do with Lucas Blackwood?" Nicholas flinched, so subtly that anyone else might have missed it. But Elena saw it. Her chest tightened. She was right. The old man let out a humorless chuckle, shaking his head. "You really don't know when to stop, do you?" Elena leaned forward, her voice softer now. "Please, I need to know." Nicholas hesitated, glancing at the door as if debating whether or not he should continue. Then, with a weary sigh, he spoke. Lucas Blackwood was the best of us. Kind, brilliant, a man who saw the world with an open heart. But kindness has no place in this world, Miss Carter. It gets you killed. Or worse. A cold shiver ran down Elena's spine. What happened to him? Nicholas stared at his glass for a long moment before answering. He fell in love. Elena's breath hitched. She already knew what he would say next. With my mother, she whispered. Nicholas nodded. Your mother was different back then. Young, full of dreams. She and Lucas, they were inseparable. Adrian never approved, of course. He believed Lucas had no place wasting his future on love. A lump formed in Elena's throat. She could see it now. The reason behind Adrian's hatred, his anger, the bitterness that never seemed to fade. But something happened, she murmured. Nicholas' expression darkened. Lucas lost everything because of that love. And Adrian never forgave your mother for it. Elena's fingers curled into fists. That's not possible. My mother never. Nicholas' gaze pinned her in place. Do you think Adrian would waste years of his life hating someone for no reason? Elena's stomach churned, but she forced herself to hold his stare. Then tell me what really happened. Nicholas exhaled sharply. Your mother and Lucas planned to run away together. They wanted to escape the Blackwood name, live a life of their own. But before they could, Lucas was ruined. Elena frowned. Ruined? Nicholas leaned forward, his voice lowering. A scandal. A setup. Someone betrayed him, and he was framed for crimes he never committed. Adrian tried to fix it, to shield him from the consequences, but Lucas wouldn't let him. He disappeared instead. A heavy silence stretched between them. Elena swallowed hard, her throat dry. And Adrian blames my mother for all of it. Nicholas nodded grimly. Lucas left everything behind, and Adrian believes it was because of her. He studied her, his expression unreadable. And now, you are paying the price. Elena's heart pounded as she processed his words. Everything suddenly made sense. The coldness in Adrian's eyes, the way he treated her like an enemy, the mercilessness behind his every action. To him, she wasn't just another employee. She was the daughter of the woman who had destroyed the only person he had ever loved. But something didn't add up. If Lucas had been framed, then who had set him up? And why? Elena stood abruptly, her mind whirling. I need to talk to Adrian. Nicholas sighed. You won't get the answers you're looking for. Not from him. Elena's jaw tightened. Then I'll make him listen. With that, she turned and left the study, Nicholas' warning echoing in her ears. She didn't care how dangerous it was. She was going to find out the truth. Elena's heart pounded as she made her way through the grand estate. The hallways felt colder, the towering walls more suffocating than ever. Every step she took carried the weight of something far greater than herself, a truth that had been buried for years, one that had shattered lives and fueled an unrelenting hatred. Adrian's door loomed ahead, dark and imposing. She hesitated for only a second before pushing it open without knocking. Inside, Adrian sat behind his desk, his piercing eyes lifting to meet hers the moment she entered. His expression was unreadable, but there was an unmistakable flicker of irritation in his gaze. You really have no concept of boundaries, do you? His voice was calm, but laced with warning. Elena stepped forward, her hands clenched at her sides. I spoke to Nicholas. Adrian's jaw tightened, though he didn't react beyond that. Did you now? I know about Lucas, she pressed, watching for any sign of emotion. I know that he and my mother. Enough. The single word sliced through the air like a blade. Adrian's fingers curled against the polished surface of his desk, his entire body rigid. You don't know anything, he said coldly. Elena refused to back down. Then tell me. If you're so sure of what happened, tell me the truth. Adrian's silence was deafening. She took a slow step closer. Lucas didn't leave because of my mother, did he? He was framed. Set up. Someone wanted to destroy him. And instead of questioning it, you spent years blaming my family. Adrian shot to his feet, his chair scraping against the floor. You have no idea what you're talking about, he growled. Then make me understand, Elena demanded. Stop hiding behind your anger and face the truth. His nostrils flared, his entire body coiled with restrained fury. You think I haven't faced the truth? I watched my brother lose everything because of your mother. He trusted her, he loved her, and in the end, she left him to rot. That's not what happened, Elena shouted. You've been blinded by your own pain for so long that you refuse to see reality. What if your brother never hated my mother? What if he left to protect her? Adrian stiffened, but it was only for a fraction of a second. It was enough. You're lying to yourself, Elena whispered, her voice softer now. You've spent your entire life trying to destroy the people you thought wronged him. But what if the real enemy was never us? Something flickered in Adrian's eyes, something raw, something that almost looked like doubt. But then, as quickly as it came, it was gone. His expression hardened once more, his jaw tightening as he took a step back. You should leave, he said, his voice ice cold. Elena's stomach twisted. Adrian, go, he snapped, turning away from her. Before I make you regret ever walking into my life. The words stung more than they should have. Elena stared at him for a long moment, at the man who had built walls so high even he couldn't see beyond them. She wanted to hate him. She wanted to walk away and let him drown in his own misery. But she couldn't. Instead, she turned and walked out, her heart heavier than ever. But she wasn't giving up. Not yet. Elena didn't sleep that night. The weight of everything she had uncovered pressed down on her, making it impossible to rest. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Adrian's face, the flicker of something behind his anger, the way he had refused to look at her when she challenged him. He knew. Deep down, he knew the truth, but he wasn't ready to accept it. Yet, she sat at the small desk in her room, staring at the file she had managed to gather. There was something here, something she was missing. The reports on Lucas' downfall had been too perfectly laid out, too well-timed. She flipped through the papers again, her eyes scanning the words over and over. Then, suddenly, something caught her attention. A name buried in the records. Nathaniel Holloway. Her breath caught. She knew that name. Holloway Industries had been one of Blackwood Enterprises' biggest competitors back then. And Nathaniel Holloway. He had been a man with everything to gain from Lucas Blackwood's downfall. Elena's hands trembled as she traced the name on the page. This was it. This was the proof Adrian needed. By the time morning arrived, Elena had made her decision. She wasn't going to wait for Adrian to come to his senses. If he refused to listen, she would force him to see the truth. She found him in the private dining room, seated alone with a cup of coffee in hand. His expression was unreadable as he watched her approach. You're persistent, he muttered, setting his cup down. And you're afraid, she countered, holding up the folder in her hands. Afraid of what you'll see if you finally let go of your anger. His eyes darkened. You don't know what you're talking about. I do, she said firmly, stepping closer. And you do too. You just don't want to admit it. She placed the file on the table and slid it toward him. Lucas wasn't betrayed by my mother. He was destroyed by Nathaniel Holloway. Adrian stiffened, his fingers hesitating before reaching for the file. Elena held her breath as he opened it, his eyes scanning the pages. She saw the exact moment realization struck him. His entire body tensed, his grip on the paper tightening. This, his voice was barely a whisper. This can't be right. It is, Elena said softly. Your brother never hated my mother. He never abandoned you. He was forced out, Adrian. And instead of fighting for him, you fought the wrong battle. Adrian's hands clenched, his jaw locking as he shut the file. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then, without a word, he stood and turned away from her. Elena's heart ached as she watched his shoulders shake with the weight of the truth. He had spent years living in the darkness of his own anger, convinced that revenge was the only way to ease his pain. Now, that foundation was crumbling beneath him. Adrian, she whispered, taking a hesitant step forward. Don't, he said sharply, his voice thick with emotion. Just don't. Elena swallowed hard. He was breaking, and for the first time, she wasn't sure if he would ever recover. But she wasn't leaving him. Not now. Not ever. Adrian stormed out of the room, his steps heavy and unsteady, as if the ground beneath him had become unfamiliar. Elena watched him go, her heart tightening with each step he took. She had cracked something deep inside him, something he had buried so completely that even he had forgotten it was there. But now it was unraveling. She followed him out into the grand hallway, ignoring the wary glances of the staff. She didn't care who was watching. She had come too far to stop now. "Adrian," she called out, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. He didn't stop. "Adrian, stop running." That made him halt. His back remained turned to her for a long moment before he finally turned around, his expression unreadable. But his eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes that had always been so cold, looked lost. "You don't understand, Elena," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then help me understand," she pleaded. "Because all I see is a man who has spent his life punishing the wrong people." His jaw clenched. "You think this is easy for me? That I can just forget everything? I built my entire life on that hatred. Every decision I made, every action I took, it was all because of what I thought happened to my brother. And now you know the truth," she said softly. "But instead of facing it, you're trying to push it away." Adrian exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "What do you want from me, Elena? Do you want me to just let it all go? Do you have any idea what that would mean?" "It means you finally let yourself breathe," she said. "It means you stop carrying a pain that was never meant to be yours in the first place." His eyes burned into hers. "You don't get it," he said. "If I let go, then what do I have left?" Elena took a step closer. "You have me." The words left her lips before she could stop them. But she didn't regret them, because they were the truth. Adrian's breath caught, just for a second, before he quickly masked it. "You don't know what you're saying," he muttered, shaking his head. "You don't know what it means to be close to me, to be in my world." Elena lifted her chin. "Then show me." A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. But instead of responding, he turned on his heel and walked away. Elena didn't stop him this time. She had done her part. Now it was up to him. Days passed. Elena expected Adrian to push her further away, to bury himself deeper in the walls he had built. But something was different. He no longer looked at her with pure hatred. He no longer threw cold, sharp words at her just to keep her at a distance. Instead, there was silence. A strange, heavy silence that neither of them knew how to break. Late one night, Elena found herself in the library, staring at the fire crackling in the massive stone fireplace. She had been struggling to sleep lately, her mind consumed with thoughts of Adrian and the truth that now hung between them. She heard footsteps behind her. She didn't have to turn around to know who it was. "You're still awake," Adrian said, his voice quiet. She exhaled softly. "So are you." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he walked past her and stood near the fire, his hands in his pockets. For the first time, she noticed how tired he looked. The sharp edges of his features were weighed down by exhaustion. His usual confidence, his unshakable presence, it was dimmed. "Lucas was the only person who ever believed in me," he said after a long silence. "He was the golden one, the one with all the charm, all the warmth. People loved him. He was supposed to take over the family empire. But I was the one left behind to clean up the mess when he disappeared." Elena turned to look at him, her heart aching at the pain in his voice. "I spent years trying to be the man he should have been," Adrian continued. "Ruthless, cold, unshakable. I told myself I was doing it for him, for justice. But now," he trailed off, shaking his head. "You don't know who you are without that anger," Elena finished softly. A bitter chuckle escaped him. "Maybe I don't." Silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Elena stepped closer. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore," she said. "You don't have to be this version of yourself just because you think it's what Lucas would have wanted." Adrian looked at her then, really looked at her. And for the first time, she saw something she had never seen in him before. Vulnerability. It was fleeting, but it was there. "You should stay away from me, Elena," he murmured. "I don't know how to be anything else." "Then let me show you," she whispered. He stared at her for a long moment, as if searching for something. Then, with a sharp breath, he stepped back. His walls slammed shut once more. "Go to bed, Elena," he said, his voice flat, "before you regret getting involved with me." Her heart clenched, but she didn't push. Not this time. Instead, she turned and walked away. But as she left, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had finally shifted. Adrian was breaking, and sooner or later, he would have to decide, hold on to the darkness that had defined him for so long, or finally let the light in. Elena could only hope that, when the time came, he would choose the right path, even if it meant risking his own heart in the process. Adrian didn't sleep that night. He sat in his office, staring at the file Elena had given him. Nathaniel Holloway. The name burned in his mind. He had spent years directing his hatred of the wrong people. He had built an empire on revenge, turned himself into the very thing he once despised. And now, for the first time, he wondered if he had become the villain in his own story. He ran a hand over his face, his chest tight, with something dangerously close to regret. Elena had tried to show him the truth, but the truth was terrifying, because if he admitted he had been wrong, if he let go of his hatred, then he had to face the fact that all these years he had been punishing an innocent woman. And worse, he had been hurting the one person who had dared to care for him despite everything. Elena. He didn't deserve her kindness, but a selfish part of him wanted it anyway. With a frustrated sigh, he pushed the file aside and leaned back in his chair. Tomorrow, he would decide what to do next. But one thing was certain. Elena had changed something inside him. And no matter how hard he tried, there was no going back. The evening air was thick with an unusual silence, the kind that made every sound feel heavier, more significant. Adrian sat in his dimly lit study, fingers pressed against his temples, his thoughts tangled in a mess of emotions he didn't want to acknowledge. He had spent years perfecting the art of indifference, of burying every weakness beneath layers of ice. But now, cracks were forming, and Elena was at the center of them all. Her voice still echoed in his mind, her words like an accusation he couldn't ignore. She had seen through him, past the ruthless mask he had so carefully crafted. No one had dared to look beyond his cruelty before. They either feared him or despised him. But not Elena. She had the audacity to pity him, to show him kindness even after everything he had done. It infuriated him. It terrified him. And yet, it was the first time in years that he had felt something other than the hollow satisfaction of revenge. His grip tightened on the edge of his desk. He didn't want this. He had spent too long nurturing his hatred, letting it define him. To let go of it now felt like admitting everything he had done was for nothing. But the more he tried to justify his actions, the more they felt like shackles tightening around his chest. He had hurt people, destroyed lives. And for what? A justice that no longer felt righteous? A vengeance that had only brought him emptiness? A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Before he could tell them to go away, the door creaked open, and Elena stepped inside. Her presence filled the room like a quiet force, soft yet unyielding. He turned away from her, unwilling to face whatever lecture she had planned for him. But she said nothing. Instead, she walked over to the fireplace, kneeling to adjust the logs, her movements deliberate and calm. "I don't need you to play maid right now," he muttered, his voice harsher than he intended. "I'm not," she replied simply, without a trace of anger. "It's just cold in here." Her words struck him in a way she probably didn't intend, because it was always cold where he was. He made sure of it. He had built a life that thrived in the absence of warmth, and yet here she was, lighting a fire, as if she belonged in his world. For a long moment, he just watched her. She was different, not because she was stronger than most, but because she carried her kindness like a weapon, using it to cut through the darkness around her. He hated it. He needed her to hate him, to fight back with the same venom he had shown her. But she never did. His eyes fell to her hands, slightly trembling as she reached for another log. That's when he noticed the exhaustion lining her features, the way her shoulders slumped just slightly. She had been spending all her time caring for her mother, and yet she was here, tending to a fire for him. "How's your mother?" The words left his lips before he could stop them. Elena stilled, as if surprised by the question. She exhaled slowly before answering. "She's managing." She wasn't telling the full truth. He could hear it in the weight of her voice. "Her condition is getting worse, isn't it?" This time, she didn't answer. Instead, she poked at the fire, watching as the flames danced higher. "I thought I had more time," she finally whispered, her voice so soft he almost missed it. Something inside him twisted at the quiet pain in her words. He had spent years turning a blind eye to suffering, convincing himself that it wasn't his problem. But this, her pain, felt different. It wasn't just some distant tragedy. It was something he could feel, something that reached into the hollow parts of him and made him wonder if he was capable of anything other than destruction. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to look away. "You should rest," he said, his voice gruff. "Staying up worrying won't change anything." Elena turned to face him then, her eyes searching his for something he wasn't ready to give. "Neither will running from your own demons," she countered softly. A muscle ticked in his jaw. She was relentless, always trying to pull something out of him that he had buried long ago. "I'm not running from anything," he said, standing abruptly. Elena didn't flinch. "Then why do you look like you're afraid of your own reflection?" He stilled, her words hitting him harder than he wanted to admit. She had a way of seeing through him, past the carefully constructed armor he wore. And he hated it, because if she saw too much, she might realize the truth, that he wasn't just a man seeking justice. He was a man who had lost his way a long time ago. Without another word, he strode past her, leaving the room before she could say anything else. But even as he walked away, her voice followed him. And for the first time, he didn't know if he could keep pretending that he didn't care. The next morning, Adrian found himself watching Elena from the balcony overlooking the gardens. She was sitting on a stone bench, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze distant. Beside her, her mother rested against a pillow, eyes closed, her breathing slow but steady. He should have left. He should have turned away before she noticed him. But he didn't. Instead, he stayed, watching as Elena gently adjusted the blanket around her mother's shoulders, murmuring something that he couldn't hear. There was a tenderness in her actions, a love so pure and unwavering that it made his chest tighten. It reminded him of a time long ago, of the way his mother used to look at Lucas, the way she would brush his hair back when he was sick, whispering words of comfort, even when her own heart was breaking. He had forgotten what that kind of love looked like. He had forgotten what it felt like to be loved at all. Adrian's grip tightened on the railing. For years, he had convinced himself that love was a weakness, a distraction that only led to pain. But as he watched Elena, he realized that maybe he had been wrong. Maybe love wasn't what destroyed people. Maybe it was the only thing that could truly save them. He turned away, his heart pounding. He couldn't do this. He couldn't let himself care, because if he did, then he would have to face the truth. And the truth was, he had spent his entire life running from the one thing he needed most. Later that evening, as he sat in his office, he found himself reaching for his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen before he finally dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "I need the best doctors," he said when the line connected. "I don't care what it costs." The voice on the other end hesitated. "For who?" Adrian hesitated too. Then, with a quiet breath, he answered, "For Elena's mother." He ended the call before he could change his mind. It wasn't an act of charity. It wasn't redemption. It was something else, something he wasn't ready to name. But as he sat there in the darkness for the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something that actually mattered. And it terrified him. Days passed, but Adrian found himself unable to shake the weight of his own actions. He told himself he wasn't doing this for Elena. It wasn't about her. It was about doing something right for once, something that wouldn't leave him feeling like he was drowning in his own darkness. But even as he repeated those words in his mind, he knew they weren't entirely true. Late at night, he often found himself standing outside Elena's quarters, listening to the soft murmurs of her voice as she spoke to her mother. He never went inside. He told himself he didn't care, that her suffering wasn't his concern. Yet he remained there, a silent observer to her quiet heartbreak. He saw the way her hands trembled when she thought no one was looking, the way she wiped at her eyes when exhaustion weighed too heavily on her. And for the first time, he felt something he never had before, an ache so deep that it made him wonder if he had been wrong about everything. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Adrian stood in the doorway of the guest room where Elena's mother rested. The doctor he had secretly arranged for was just finishing his examination, speaking in hushed tones with a nurse by the bedside. Elena sat on the edge of the bed, holding her mother's frail hand, her head bowed. "She's stable for now," the doctor said gently. "We've managed to slow the progression, but she needs continued treatment." Elena exhaled, the tension in her shoulders barely easing. "Thank you, doctor. I don't even know how we could afford this kind of care." The doctor glanced in Adrian's direction, his eyes flickering with recognition before he quickly masked his reaction. Adrian gave him a slight shake of his head, a silent command to say nothing. The doctor hesitated but then nodded. "The arrangements have already been taken care of." Elena's brow furrowed. "By who?" "The hospital fund," the doctor lied smoothly. "A private donation covers cases like these." Elena let out a shaky breath of relief, her gratitude evident. "Whoever it was, I wish I could thank them." Adrian turned away before she could look in his direction. He didn't want her thanks. He didn't deserve it. That night, he sat alone in his study, staring at the untouched glass of whiskey in his hand. He had spent years punishing himself, clinging to the past, because it was easier than letting go. But now, something was shifting inside him, something he didn't know how to control. Because for the first time in years, he had done something not out of vengeance, but out of a desire to help. And that terrified him more than anything else. The days blurred together, but one night changed everything. Adrian had just finished a late meeting when he caught sight of Elena in the garden, sitting on the stone bench, her arms wrapped around herself. Even from a distance, he could see the sadness in her posture, the quiet grief that weighed heavily on her. Before he could stop himself, he was walking toward her. "Elena." She didn't turn to look at him. "What do you want?" Her voice lacked its usual warmth. She wasn't pushing him away with anger. She was simply tired. Adrian hesitated, the words he wanted to say foreign on his tongue. "Is she?" "She's still fighting," Elena murmured. "But it feels like I'm losing her, little by little." She let out a shaky breath, finally turning to look at him. "Why do you hate me so much?" The question caught him off guard. "You've done everything to make my life miserable, but I've never wronged you," she continued. "So tell me, Adrian, why?" The wind was cold, but it wasn't nearly as chilling as the silence that stretched between them. Adrian clenched his fists. He could give her the same empty answer he had given himself for years. He could tell her that this was justice, that he had every right to hate her. But he couldn't bring himself to say those words, because, deep down, he knew they weren't true. "I don't hate you," he admitted quietly. Elena frowned. "Then why?" "Because you make me feel things I don't want to feel," he cut in, his voice raw. "Because you remind me of everything I lost. Because every time I look at you, I see someone who refuses to break, and it terrifies me." Elena's breath hitched, but she didn't look away. Adrian let out a humorless chuckle. "I built my life around the idea that revenge would fix everything, that if I made others suffer, I would finally find peace. But you," he shook his head, "you ruined everything." Elena swallowed hard. "Because I didn't hate you back?" "Because you shouldn't have forgiven me," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you did anyway." For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his regret. He had tried so hard to convince himself that he was right, that his actions were justified. But standing here, in front of the one person who had every reason to despise him, he realized that he had been lying to himself all along. "I was wrong," he said, the words foreign and heavy. "I was wrong about everything." Elena looked at him for a long time, her expression unreadable. Then, without warning, she reached out and took his hand. Adrian stiffened, his breath catching in his throat. Her touch was warm, so warm that it made him realize just how cold he had been for so long. "You're allowed to change, Adrian," she whispered. "You don't have to carry this alone." Something inside him shattered. For years, he had lived in the shadows of his own mistakes, convincing himself that he was beyond redemption. But here she was, offering him something he never thought he deserved: understanding. A lump formed in his throat. He wanted to pull away, to retreat into the safety of his solitude. But he didn't. Instead, he held onto her hand just a little tighter. And for the first time, He allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could be saved. Elena sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the faint cracks on the ceiling, feeling as if her entire world was splintering apart. She had spent so much time believing that love could conquer all, that if she just held on long enough, Adrian would find his way out of the darkness. But now, she wasn't so sure. He had changed. She could see it in the way he looked at her, in the way he hesitated before speaking, in the way his touch was no longer fueled by power, but by something gentler. But was it enough? She wanted to believe it was, but a part of her knew that as long as Adrian held on to his guilt, there would always be a wall between them. And love, real love, couldn't survive behind walls. The decision weighed heavy in her heart, but deep down, she knew what she had to do. The next morning, she found Adrian in his study, standing by the window with his back to her. He turned when she entered, his expression unreadable, but she saw the flicker of something in his eyes, relief, maybe even hope. "Elena," he murmured, stepping toward her. "Did you sleep?" She shook her head. "I need to talk to you." He frowned, sensing the shift in her tone. "What is it?" Her heart clenched painfully, but she forced herself to speak. "I can't do this anymore, Adrian." He froze, his entire body going rigid. "What do you mean?" Tears burned at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I love you, but love isn't enough when you're still chained to your past. You're trying, I know you are, but you're still punishing yourself, and as long as you do, we'll never be free." Adrian's jaw tightened. "I'm not." "Yes, you are." She took a shaky breath. "You think I don't see it? The way you pull away when you start to feel happy? The way you look at me like you're afraid you don't deserve this." His hands curled into fists at his sides, but he didn't argue, because they both knew she was right. "I can't be with someone who won't let go of his own ghosts," she whispered. "I want Adrian. I want to believe that love will fix this. But I can't be the only one fighting for us." The silence between them was unbearable. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're leaving." Elena swallowed hard. "I have to." His eyes darkened with something raw, something broken. "And if I let you go?" Tears slipped down her cheeks as she looked at him. The man she had fought so hard to understand, the man she had fallen in love with despite everything. "Then maybe you'll finally find a reason to let go of the past." Adrian didn't move, didn't say a word as she turned and walked away. And this time, he didn't try to stop her. The days that followed were hollow. Adrian moved through his life like a ghost, going through the motions but feeling nothing. His empire, his wealth, his power, none of it mattered anymore. The control he had once valued so much now felt meaningless. For the first time, he truly understood what loss felt like. Not the loss of revenge, not the loss of power, but the loss of something real. He had spent so long chasing something that had only left him empty. Now, the one thing that had ever made him feel whole was gone, and there was no one to blame but himself. But wallowing in regret wouldn't change anything. If there was one thing Elena had taught him, it was that love wasn't about possession or control. It was about choice. And if he truly loved her, then it was time he made the right one. For the first time in his life, Adrian stopped chasing power. He stepped down from a ruthless empire he had built, distancing himself from the business that had once defined him. He quietly repaired what he had broken, not for redemption, not to win Elena back, but simply because it was the right thing to do. He rebuilt the cafe that he had once destroyed, ensuring that Elena would never struggle the way she had before. He made sure her mother continued to receive the best medical care, without ever revealing his involvement. He asked for nothing in return, and for the first time in years, he finally felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. But even as he worked to fix the damage he had caused, he never once tried to seek out Elena. Because love wasn't about forcing someone to stay. It was about giving them the freedom to choose. And if she ever came back to him, he wanted it to be because she truly wanted to. Elena stood outside the cafe, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. The place was exactly as she remembered it. The warm, inviting glow of the lights, the scent of freshly brewed coffee drifting through the air, the faint hum of laughter from inside. But it shouldn't have been here. She had seen it burn. She had watched the walls crumble, her dreams reduced to nothing but ash. It had been one of the most devastating moments of her life, and now, standing in front of it again, whole and restored, she felt like she was staring at a ghost. Her hands trembled as she pushed the door open. The bell above the entrance chimed softly, and the familiar sight of her cafe greeted her. It was identical, down to the smallest detail. The wooden counter, the framed pictures on the wall, the cozy seating in the corner where she had once spent late nights sketching new menu ideas. But how? She turned to the barista behind the counter, a young woman she didn't recognize. "Excuse me," Elena said, her voice shaking. "Who owns this place now?" The girl tilted her head. "Oh, I'm not sure. The owner never really comes around. He just set everything up and left." Her heart pounded. She already knew the answer. Adrian. He had done this. But why? If this had been months ago, she would have assumed it was another manipulation, another way to control her. But he hadn't come to her. He hadn't called. He hadn't even tried to use this as a way to win her back. No, this time he had asked for nothing. And that realization shook her more than anything else. For the first time, she wondered if Adrian had truly changed. Not for her, not to prove something, but because he had finally let go of the past. Her hands clenched at her sides as emotions swirled inside her. He had given up everything, his power, his empire, even his pride, and asked for nothing in return. And that was the moment she knew. He loved her, not in the way he had before, when it had been tangled in control and revenge, but in the way that mattered, in a way that was real. She stepped outside, taking a shaky breath. The street was quiet, the world around her moving as if nothing had changed. But everything had, because now she had a choice. For so long, Adrian had been the one pulling the strings. But this time it was different. This time, the decision was hers. And she already knew what she wanted to do. Adrian stood on the balcony of his penthouse, staring at the city below. The skyline stretched out endlessly before him, the lights twinkling like distant stars. He had spent years building this empire, years chasing power, revenge, and control. And now, none of it mattered. For the first time in his life, he had let go. There was no more hatred in his heart, no more thirst for vengeance. And though he had lost Elena in the process, he had finally found something he never thought he would: peace. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He wasn't expecting anyone. Frowning, he made his way across the apartment and pulled the door open, and froze. Elena stood there, her eyes locked onto his, her expression unreadable. His breath caught. "Elena," he whispered, as if saying her name would make her disappear. She didn't speak for a moment, just studying him, searching for something. Then, finally, she stepped inside, her voice quiet but steady. "I went to the cafe today." His jaw clenched, but he said nothing. "I know you rebuilt it." She took a deep breath. "I know you did it for me." Adrian looked away. "It was never about getting you back." "I know." Her response surprised him. He turned back, meeting her gaze, but she didn't look angry. If anything, she looked sad. "You could have come to me," she said softly. "You could have used this as a way to make me forgive you. But you didn't." He exhaled slowly. "I didn't do it for forgiveness, Elena. I did it because it was the right thing to do." For a long moment, she just looked at him. Then she stepped closer, and his heart pounded as he felt the warmth of her presence. "You once took away my choices," she whispered. "You manipulated my life, made decisions for me." He swallowed hard. "I know, but this time you didn't." Her eyes softened. "This time, you let me decide." Adrian held his breath. He wanted to reach for her, to hold her, to tell her that he loved her more than anything. But he didn't, because this time it had to be her choice. Slowly, she lifted a hand, her fingers grazing against his. The touch was feather-light, but it sent a shiver through him. "I came back," she murmured. His heart nearly stopped. "Not because I have to," she continued, her voice trembling. "Not because I feel obligated, but because I want to." Adrian felt something inside him crack open. He had spent so long believing he had lost her forever. But now, here she was choosing him, not because of revenge, not because of manipulation, but because she loved him. "Elena," His voice was hoarse, thick with emotion. She reached up, cupping his face in her hands. "I love you, Adrian." He let out a shuddering breath, his hands coming up to hold hers. "I don't deserve you," he whispered. She smiled softly. "That's not for you to decide." And then, before he could say anything else, she pulled him down, pressing her lips to his. The moment their lips met, everything else faded away. There was no more past, no more pain, no more vengeance. There was only this, two broken souls finding their way back to each other. As Adrian wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, he realized something. This wasn't the end of their story. This was only the beginning. A future not built on hate, but on love. A love that stood the test of time. And for the first time in his life, Adrian knew what it truly meant to be free.